Poštovani gledalci, dobrodošli u Granice istoka. Ja sam Harun Karčić. U ovoj emisiji analiziramo diplomatske i ekonomske odnose Irana i Turske. Osmanlije i Perzijanci su stoljećima ratovali, trgovali, ali i sarađivali. Zbog njihove nesporne vojno-političke moći, ali i neposredne blizine, nadmetali su se za regionalnu hegemoniju. Danas njihove države nasljednice, Turska i Iran, su duboko uvezane i međusobno ovisne. Turizam i uzajamne posjete cvjetaju, ali u političkom spektrumu te dvije države se dijametralno razilaze, naročito u vezi sa pitanjem Sirije, Iraka, Azerbejdžana, Arapskog zaljeva i SAD-a. Iran i Turska, prijatelji, neprijatelji ili konkurencija? Prije nego što pređemo na detaljnije analize sa našim sagovornicima, pogledamo kratki presjek bilateralnih odnosa te dvije države u proteklih nekoliko decenija.
Odnosi Irana i Turske 1970. i 80. bili su na niskom nivou. Koliko zbog politike Ankare o okretanju prema zapadnim zemljama, toliko i zbog iranske podrške Kurdistanskoj radničkoj stranci PKK. Ipak posjeta turskog predsjednika Ahmeta Nedžeta Sezara Iranu 2002. godine, kao i dolazak AKP ili Stranke pravde i razvoja u Turskoj na vlast, bila je svojevrsna prekretnica. Ta stranka bila je zainteresovana za poboljšanje odnosa sa susjednim zemljama. Dogovoreni su trgovinski sporazumi, prekogranična saradnja i zajednička borba protiv PKK. Ekonomije tih zemalja su imale veliku korist od toga, posebno iranska, koja je godinama bila pod sankcijama. Na diplomatskom polju Ankara je podupirala iransko pravo na razvoj nuklearne energije u civilne svrhe i protivila se izolaciji te zemlje. Međutim, arapsko proljeće je prekinulo medeni mjesec Irana i Turske. Kako su autokratske arapske vlade padale, konzervativni iranski dužnosnici zabrinuli su se kako bi se to isto i njima moglo desiti. Teheran je odlučio politički, vojno i ekonomski podržati svog saveznika Bašara al-Asada na vlasti u Siriji. To se nije dopalo Ankari, koja je stala na stranu sirijskih građana, a kasnije i naoružane opozicije. Istovremeno, Turska je razvijala bliske odnose s regionalnom kurdskom vladom na sjeveru Iraka, a Teheran sa šiitskom vladom u Bagdadu. Ankara i Teheran službeno sarađuju u borbi protiv PKK, ali turska obavještajna služba vjeruje da Iran potajno finansira PKK, jer time želi oslabiti Tursku, kao i regionalnu kurdsku vladu na sjeveru Iraka, inače saveznik Ankare. Proteklih mjeseci, međutim, Ankara je ublažila svoje stajalište prema Asadu. Teheran, Asadov glavni saveznik, pozdravio je taj preokret. Zatim se dogodio pokušaj vojnog udara 15. jula 2016. godine. Iranski vladini dužnosnici su bili prvi koji su iskazali podršku predsjedniku Erdoganu i vladi Turske, mnogo prije evropskih i američkih saveznika Ankare. To je mnogo značilo Ankari i uslijedilo je otopljenje odnosa. Bilo kako bilo, Teheran i Ankara imaju mnogo sličnosti. I Iran i Turska su regionalne sile koje žele dominirati Bliskim istokom. Istovremeno, obje države imaju i duboko međusobno nepovjerenje, koliko zbog historijskih razloga, toliko zbog trenutnih političkih oscilacija. Ipak, i jednoj i drugoj državi mir i stabilnost regije su najvažniji. Sanel Kajan, Granice istoka.
Naša gošća s kojom ćemo više o svemu ovome je novinarka Al Jazeera English Birce Bora, koja se bavi analizom iransko-turskih odnosa. Birce, hello and welcome to our program. Now, would you see how does Turkey view Iran? A friend, a foe, or a strategic ally?
Well, I think at the moment it's really hard to define Turkey's relationship with Iran in those terms. They're definitely not allies, but they're also not foes. So I would say they are regional rivals. I think rival is the word that would describe the relationship between these two countries the best. But of course they're having transaction alliances, especially when it comes to security from time to time. And also they have a really strong trade relationship. So this rivalry is not causing them to become foes completely, but of course they are not on the same side in any of the strategic wars that we're observing these days in the Middle East.
From Ankara's perspective, is Iran pursuing Shia policies in the region, or perhaps, as President Recep Tayyip Erdogan calls it, Persian nationalism?
Well, Ankara, especially during the crisis in February when Turkey's presence, military presence in Iraq caused a lot of problems between Iran and Turkey, President Erdogan and also the Turkish Foreign Minister Mevlut Çavuşoğlu made it quite clear that they were disturbed by Iran's policies, and they described these policies as sectarian. Turkish Foreign Minister emphasized that Ankara at the moment views what Iran is trying to do as to create a Shia state in the Levant. And Turkey is, of course, completely against this. And they are over and over again emphasizing that they will do everything in their power to stop Iran from becoming more and more influential in the region. But of course, there's a counter argument to that. If you ask Iranian authorities or analysts, they're going to say that what they are seeing from their point of view is Turkey is the one who's doing sectarianism and trying to have dominance over the Sunni forces and Sunni populations in the region. And they are all over and over again calling Turkey a neo-Ottomanist power. They're saying Erdogan is now following neo-Ottoman policies and trying to go back to the glory days of the empire. And of course they are also against this. So we're seeing a big clash between the two powers in the region, and they're both accusing each other of acting in sectarian ways.
Mm. Who are Ankara's major allies in the region, and who are Iran's major allies in the region?
Oh, well, this is a hard question to answer these days because everybody seems to be changing sides. But of course, historically, when we look at this, Turkey is a NATO ally, and Turkey had always been on the side of US in the Middle East. And these days, we are viewing Turkey is coming closer and closer to Gulf countries. And they're trying to assess what President Trump's stance is going to be in the Middle East. So I would say Turkey is still on the side of the US, and they are quite expecting a lot from the Trump administration. And they're a lot more hopeful at the moment, especially after President Trump decided to bomb Syria, Bashar Assad's military base, after the chemical attack. So I would say at the moment Turkey is on the side of the US, and Iran is, of course, as we know, is in an alliance with Russia. So Turkey and Iran are on the opposite sides of this conflict, and they have long been in these positions.
With Ankara's worsening ties with the European Union and the US, do you think Turkey will turn more towards Iran and perhaps neighboring countries in the region?
Oh, well, this is a hard question to answer. Of course, we observed Turkey's ties with the European Union, especially before the referendum. The relations got worse and worse over time. But we should be careful when we say Turkey is completely changing sides, or Turkey's alliance with the US especially is ending. Because we saw after the referendum, Donald Trump was the first leader to call and congratulate Erdogan. And we're seeing the US is following a more aggressive policy towards Iran under the Trump administration. So it is not easy to say that Turkey is moving away from the US. But also on the other side, as I mentioned before, Iran and Turkey are regional rivals. And I don't see it possible for Turkey to come closer to Iran in this point in time. Mm-hmm. Turkey's alliance with Iran could only strictly be economic. You know, they have incredibly developed trade relations. So they're always going to be trading and doing business together. But I don't see in recent times that Turkey is going to replace the European Union or the US with Iran in their policies.
Is a proxy war between Iran and Turkey possible in Syria and in Iraq, or is it already taking place?
Well, when we're talking about a proxy war, we have to admit that the biggest actors in the region at the moment are Russia and the US. And US is changing its stance and being more and more active in the region. And as a result, I think if you're going to talk about a proxy war, this proxy war is going to be, or is, between Russia and the US. So both Iran and Turkey are going to be secondary and regional actors in this proxy war. And of course, we already seen Iran and Turkey facing each other in Iraq. And after Mosul, Iraq's second city, is taken back by the militia forces and the Iraqi army from ISIL, I think we're going to see an escalation of this problem because, as you may know, in February, President Erdogan was quite clear when he said he's not going to allow Mosul and the Sunni population in Mosul city to be controlled by Iran-backed Shia militias. And he said he and Turkey is going to protect these people no matter what. And even Baghdad is against this, he doesn't care. So it shows us, while the proxy war is actually between Russia and the US, an escalation between Iran and Turkey is quite possible, especially in the aftermath of the Mosul battle.
Now, when you look back at the last 10 years, would you say that after the resignation of Ahmet Davutoğlu as Prime Minister of Turkey, relations between Tehran and Ankara have worsened?
Well, I wouldn't connect the worsening relationship to Davutoğlu or any singular figure in the Turkish government, because to understand how Turkey's relationship with Iran fluctuates, we need to look at more global and strategic developments. For example, what affected Iran's stance in the region mostly was the deal it made with the United States, the nuclear deal. When the embargo was lifted, Iran started to feel more confident and started to feel that it can be more influential in the region. And this caused Iran to become a stronger, more aggressive rival against Turkey. And I would say not Davutoğlu's resignation or any change in the actual Turkish government towards Tehran affected this deterioration of the relationships, but it was mostly Iran's newly found strength and confidence is what caused this. As we know, Iran, after the nuclear deal, has been acting more aggressively towards its neighbors, and it has been more active in the wars surrounding it. So I would say it wasn't about Davutoğlu's resignation or Turkish government changing their stance against Iran, but it was mostly Iran changing its policies towards its neighbors.
Right, Birce, thank you so much for speaking to us. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure too. Have a nice
Poštovani
day.
gledalci, bila je to Birce Bora, novinarka Al Jazeera English iz Dohe. Turska i Iran imaju granicu dugo 560 km. Iscrtana je mirovnim sporazumom iz 1639. godine i nepromijenjena ostala do danas. Te dvije države imaju gotovo isti broj stanovnika i Turska i Iran blizu 80 miliona. Ali Turska je sunijska država sa malom alevijskom zajednicom, a Iran šiitska sa malom sunijskom zajednicom. Historijski gledano, u odnosima te dvije države bilo je nadmetanja, ratova, ali i saradnje. Početkom 20. stoljeća dvije zemlje su potpisale sporazum o prijateljstvu i nenapadanju, što je dodatno ojačalo njihove dobrosusjedske odnose. Njihovi odnosi unaprijeđeni su dolaskom Stranke pravde i razvoja na vlast 2002. godine u Turskoj i otvaranjem te zemlje prema susjedima. Iran danas zadovoljava petinu turskih potreba za plinom, izvozi i petrohemijske sirovine i plastiku. Zauzvrat, Turska u Iran izvozi zlato, željezo, čelik i tekstil. Turska je Iranu trgovinski most sa Evropom, jer više od petine iranske kopnene trgovine prolazi preko njezine teritorije. Vrijeme od 2010. do 2012. godine smatra se zlatnim periodom iransko-turskih odnosa. Trgovinska razmjena je 2012. godine iznosila 22 milijarde dolara. Ali onda je počeo rat u Siriji. Došlo je do političkih nesuglasica Teherana i Ankare. Turska je podržala opoziciju, a Iran vladu Bašara el-Asada. Sve to je utjecalo i na trgovinu. 2013. godine trgovinska razmjena pala je za trećinu i nastavila padati 2014. kao i 2015. godini, da bi 2016. bila tek 9,6 milijardi dolara. Uprkos političkim nesuglasicama i padu trgovine, Iranci i Turci se i dalje međusobno posjećuju. 2016. godine 1,7 miliona Iranaca posjetilo je Tursku, dok je u isto vrijeme gotovo 400.000 Turaka posjetilo Iran. Pogledajmo neke citate turskih i iranskih zvaničnika proteklih godina. Među izjavama bilo je onih umirujućeg tona, ali i onih nešto oštrijih. Govoreći o ulozi Irana i Turske u regionu, turski predsjednik je rekao: Iran i Turska nose veliki teret odgovornosti u regionu. Trebalo bi ojačati međusobnu saradnju kako bi se ublažile regionalne tenzije. O ulozi u regionu sličnim tonom je govorio i Hasan Ruhani. Kazao je: Iran i Turska su ključne zemlje za rješavanje sukoba u Siriji. Terorizam je zajednički problem protiv kojeg se moramo boriti jer su ekstremisti neprijatelji čovječanstva i islama. Međutim, bilo je i nešto oštrih izjava i optužbi za širenje šiitskog utjecaja u regionu. Mevlut Čavuşoğlu, turski ministar vanjskih poslova, izjavio je da Iran želi Siriju i Irak pretvoriti u šiitske države. Na što je glasnogovornik Iranskog ministarstva vanjskih poslova reagovao sljedećim riječima: nadamo se da će u budućnosti mudrije govoriti o Iranu kako bi izbjegli našu reakciju. Bićemo strpljivi sa Turskom, ali i to ima granicu. Nastavljamo analizirati iransko-turske odnose. Pozdravljam Nadera Hašemija, profesora međunarodnih odnosa na Univerzitetu u Denveru. Professor Hašemi, thank you so much for joining us. Now, would you take us briefly through the current Iranian-Turkish rivalry in the region? Would you say that it dates back to the Ottoman-Persian wars?
No, I think that's a myth. I think the origins of the crisis really begin in 1979. Up until 1979, both countries had relatively good relations. They were both allied with the West. But of course, as a result of Iran's 1979 revolution, there was deep ideological and political differences that emerged. Both countries are regional powers. And from 1979, right up until, I would argue, 2002, there was quite a bit of tension and a deep disagreement over how each country viewed the future of the Middle East and how they were trying to exert their influence in many ways in directly opposite ways. So I think that's really the backdrop to the current relationship between the two countries.
Why was 2002 a major turning point in Iranian-Turkish relations?
Well, that's when the AK party, comes to power and forms the government of the Republic of Turkey, and its Islamic identity was welcomed in Iran. There was a sense that now the ideological differences rooted in a strong interpretation of secularism in Turkey versus an Islamic conception of the world that informs Iran's foreign policy, those ideological differences had considerably narrowed. But having said that, within Iran, there was deep divisions over the rise of the AK party. Reformist and pro-democracy elements within Iran's ruling system viewed the AK party with a lot of favor, liked the attempt to reconcile democracy with Islam. But hardliners within Iran, who control effectively the political system, were still deeply suspicious. They didn't like the fact that Turkey was allied with NATO. They didn't like the fact that Turkey had close relations with Saudi Arabia. And they also viewed the rise of the AK party and its Islamic identity as a rivalry toward Iran's own claim to be the leader of the Muslim world. In other words, now you had a neighboring country using Islamic themes to rally public opinion, particularly in the Arab world, that was challenging Iran's claim to be the sole voice and representative and model for the Islamic world. And we saw that, I think, quite clearly during the Arab Spring, when many of the political Islamist parties that came to power in Tunisia and in Egypt explicitly stated that their model was Turkey and the AK party, not the Islamic Republic of Iran. And that was deeply embarrassing to hardliners within Iran. And so those tensions existed back then, and they still exist today. If you read the hardline press in Iran, they're still very critical of Turkey and of Erdogan.
Mm-hmm. Now, Turkey has been cozying up to Sunni Arab states while Iran has been militarily supporting its Shia allies in the region. Is sectarianism the main reason for the mutual mistrust?
No. I actually just wrote a book on the topic called Sectarianization, Mapping the New Politics of the Middle East. And what we argue in the book is that sectarianism is simply used as a tool by ruling regimes to mobilize people in pursuit of national interests. So I don't think the root of the conflict between Turkey and Iran today is rooted in sectarianism, but I think both countries try to use a certain sectarian language to mobilize people around and in support of its own agenda. Fundamentally, I think the root of the conflict today between Turkey and Iran revolves around Syria. When the uprising in Syria began in 2011, Turkey took a very strong position, and I would argue at the time a very principled position, saying that Bashar al-Assad is a dictator, a mass murderer, he has to go, while Iran viewed the question of Syria through its own regional lens. And it was deeply fearful that if Bashar al-Assad, its main ally in the region, were to be toppled, Iran's influence in the region will suffer a major blow, and its access to Hezbollah, a major part of its national security doctrine in terms of how it views Israel in the West, will suffer a severe hit. And so over the course of the last 6 years, the differing positions that Ankara and Tehran have taken with respect to the conflict in Syria has been, I think, a main source of the antagonism between the two countries.
Right. Turkish intelligence sources claim that Iran supports the PKK and uses it to destabilize Turkey and the Kurdistan regional government in Iraq, which is again allied to Ankara. At the same time, Iran is fighting a Kurdish insurgency of its own, the PJAK, in the Kandil Mountains. How do you make sense of that?
Yeah, I think the claims that Iran is, supporting the PKK are grossly exaggerated. It reminds me of the rhetoric that we hear today about Iranian support in Yemen for the Houthis. There is support, but I think the claims that Iran is sort of a major player and backer of either the Houthis in Yemen or the PKK are gross exaggerations. I suspect there is some clandestine, unofficial support for the PKK that elements of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps have continued to exercise simply as a way of having perhaps some leverage over Turkey if things go really bad with respect to the conflict in Syria. But Iran fundamentally, politically, has no interest in supporting a rebel, terrorist insurgency that is trying to destabilize a neighboring country when it's facing a very similar problem on its own soil. So I think it's playing a very careful game that it's trying to sort of still maintain some links to the PKK if Iran feels that it needs to use that leverage over Turkey at some later point. But I don't think it's accurate to say that Iran is a major open backer and supporter and sustainer of the PKK for reasons that I just mentioned.
But is it not true that Iran hosted PKK training camps in the late 70s and 80s?
Yeah, maybe at that time, but I mean that was almost 40 years ago, right? So a lot has changed since then, and there's an attempt by Iran and Turkey to officially deal with their own Kurdish insurgency problem. I think politically and officially they both have the same view on the danger and the threat that these Kurdish insurgency groups pose for each other's country. But of course, Iran is an authoritarian regime. It has a lot of, informal interests that it pursues through its security forces as a way of exercising its leverage throughout the region. So I suspect behind the scenes there have been links and there has been an attempt to maintain some sort of contact with the PKK, but not officially, not formally, and not in a way that Iran would like to, brag about or announce, because it would be a huge embarrassment for its own foreign policy.
Right. Would you say that Iran is welcoming Ankara's warming relations with Moscow and its ever-growing frustration with NATO?
Oh, absolutely. One of the big concerns that Iran has with respect to Turkey is that it's still allied with the West. It's part of NATO. So recently, over the last, I would say, 6 months, the shift that we've seen in Turkey with respect to its mending of relations with Russia after it shot down a Russian aircraft over Syria, the attempt to try and work together to diplomatically solve the conflict in Syria, that is very much welcomed in Tehran, because Tehran is effectively allied with Putin and with Russia in Syria. So the closer that Ankara gets to Moscow, that's largely welcomed in Tehran. And I think they also welcome the fact that the United States is effectively squeezed out of that equation. Tehran and the Islamic Republic of Iran would be very happy to try and work with Russia and with Turkey to solve the problem of Syria, because it hopes that it could perhaps enforce its own will over the future outcome of a potential resolution of the tragedy of the Syrian conflict.
Right, Professor Nader Hašemi, thank you so much for your time.
Happy to be with you. Thank you.
Poštovani gledalci, bio je to Nader Hašemi, profesor međunarodnih odnosa na Univerzitetu u Denveru. Turska i Iran žele obnoviti staru slavu na jedan ili drugi način. Koliko god se međusobno politički razilazili, neophodni su jedni drugima. Trenutno se Iran i Turska indirektno sukobljavaju u Siriji, gdje Turska podržava sunijske pobunjenike, dok Iran finansira šijske paravojne formacije i vladu Bašara el-Asada. Sukobljavaju se indirektno i u Iraku, jer Turska podržava vladu autonomnog iračkog Kurdistana, dok Iranci podržavaju šijsku vladu u Bagdadu i šijske milicije u toj zemlji. Ali na kraju svega, Iranci i Turci su osuđeni živjeti jedni pored drugih, a stabilno susjedstvo u regiji u interesu je svih. Bilo je to sve u ovom izdanju emisije Granice istoka. Cijelu emisiju možete pogledati na našem web portalu aljazeera.net/Balkans. Hvala na pažnje.